But going through that, it made me realize, and it's sort of obvious, but it made me really appreciate how sensitive these issues can be for people and how people aren't willing to open up quite often about genetic conditions.
Kia ora, I'm Gabby Lardies, staff writer at The Spin-Off, filling in for my editor Madeline Chapman. Welcome to Behind the Story, where we go behind the scenes of a big article on The Spin-Off from the week. Today I'm talking to our Aotea editor Liam Rātana about his story, The Genetic Gamble, having children when you carry a hereditary condition. It takes an inside look at what people have to face when they carry a genetic condition and are considering starting a family. There are tricky ethical choices, of course, but also less than ideal medical and legal systems. I wanted to ask him why he chose this topic and why he approached it the way that he did. Here's Liam Rātana on Behind the Story. Welcome, Liam. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Kia ora, Gabby.
Once again, you're a regular visitor these days.
Thank you for choosing me.
It's an honour I bestow with great discernment.
I feel very honoured indeed.
Yippee! So we're here to talk about your article that we published on Tuesday morning on the site. It's called The Genetic Gamble, Having Children When You Carry a Hereditary Condition. It's about the sticky choice that people have to make if they're deciding whether to have a family or not, and then all these kind of medical systems and a few legal ones that they come up against. What got you interested in this topic?
That's a very great summary of the story. Thanks, Gabby. I think if I start at the beginning, it was inspired by a message that I received from my auntie, so my mum's sister, who basically said via Facebook, "Hey Liam, Brandon, my cousin, her son, had this testing done because he is expecting a baby very soon." They live in Australia, and she said, "You might find this interesting." So I clicked on the link, and it was a report from the government of New South Wales or something like that, the New South Wales Medical Authority or whatever it's called over there. And it took me a little bit to decipher, but basically it was confirming that my mum's sister and my first cousin were carriers of a genetic mutation relating to hearing loss. So my mum was effectively fully deaf from birth. My mother's sister, my auntie Jackie, she was effectively fully deaf from birth. And I want to say ignorantly, had never put two and two together and said, "Oh, that's obviously a genetic condition." I just hadn't stopped to even consider it, to be honest with you, which is quite silly, but sort of glaringly obvious when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. So long story short, my cousin did this test, got it confirmed that we carried this gene that's basically mutated. And there was a chance that any of our future children could have hearing loss because of this gene mutation. So it's about a 1 in 100 chance, unless our partners also are a carrier of this gene. So that...
And then it would increase.
That would increase the likelihood to, I want to say, maybe 1 in 50. Or it increases it greatly anyway. So that was sort of the impetus for me wanting to take a look at how people navigate these sorts of scenarios here in Aotearoa. And that led to me writing this piece about exactly that. So as you know, I've already got a son, Tuida, who's...
So cute.
Yeah, thanks. He's very cute. He's just turned 1 in January, so as far as we know from all the testing, he's completely fine in terms of hearing, but There's sort of that concern that I have about any future children that I might have with my partner and what their likelihood of having this condition could be as well. So, yeah, that led to me going down this path, speaking to a bunch of people and finding out that it is a very complex landscape.
Yeah, and part of what you found was there's quite a lot of differences in our medical system and that of Australia. Is that is that the reason that your cousin was tested in the first place, those kinds of differences? Like, had you been in Australia, would you have known to test?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't definitively answer that, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
What I can say is that when we were going through Siobhan, my partner's birth with pregnancy, with our son, you know, there's a bunch of questions that your midwife will ask you about genetic conditions and things. And I honestly can't even remember. I'm pretty sure that I told them that my mother was deaf from birth, but it sort of never went beyond that. It was sort of, they might have noted it down, and that was fine. She had several health conditions that impacted her when she was alive. So those sort of took precedence in my mind because that's how my mother passed away, was because of some other unrelated conditions that she had. So that sort of the question about hearing loss never really crossed my mind too much because I was so worried about the things that impacted her physical well-being So in terms of my cousin, he obviously was a bit more aware that, you know, it's important to test for genetic conditions, whereas I was sort of just asking questions, and I'm not sure exactly what his path looked like, but what I discovered in this story is that people in Australia have greater access to a wider range of genetic testing and screening than we do here in Aotearoa. So he obviously went and had some of this testing done and probably raised it with the people that he was speaking with about his mother's condition. So I'm assuming that they were looking quite closely at the genes that relate to hearing loss, and this might have been on their radar. For comparison, if this was in New Zealand and I wanted to go get screening done for a whole range of different genetic conditions, then it would be quite a costly, lengthy process. And there's quite a few issues with that as well in terms of a lack of infrastructure here in New Zealand and things like that.
That was another really interesting part of your article, I think, when you brought up the issue that a lot of the tests will go overseas, and then that really brings up a lot of concerns about data sovereignty, because, I don't know, I guess because things go so far away and you're not really sure what's going to happen to them over there. Is that a kind of conversation that you've been involved in before, like the data sovereignty?
Yeah, I think data sovereignty, that term, is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and we sort of tend to think about it in terms of data on our phone or our digital footprint and how that data is used because it's so heavily utilised by advertising companies and media companies, etc., etc. But our DNA and our genetic information is arguably the most important data that we have, right? So, I had thought about this prior, just briefly, you know, with all the genetic tests that are available out there, Ancestry and .com and all these 21andMe and these different tests you can do to figure out or help figure out bits of your genetic puzzle. And so I had done a little bit of reading on that, what happens with your data, but, you know, what these companies do with it. Different companies have different policies and can store it in different ways and all this sort of stuff. When it came to this story, it wasn't a particularly prominent theme or issue in my mind at that point in time. I guess I was more just wanting to get like an overall picture of what the road looks like for people in a similar situation to me. But the more I spoke to different people, the more I realized that it was quite a big issue for people in terms of getting testing done for genetic conditions once they found out that their DNA would be sent overseas and stored in labs over there, and how will it be disposed of? There's this inherent lack of trust from Māori and Pacifica communities about the health, or with the health system, and about how their data is used and stuff like that. DNA is obviously quite a tapu thing, like we've touched on. So yeah, all of those things sort of combined into me realizing that data sovereignty and your privacy is quite a big thing, and there's this severe lack of Polynesian data in these global databases, DNA as well. So it's sort of like gold when they can get their hands on it, and there's this big drive at the moment to increase the amount of Polynesian DNA in these banks and databases, but I think it's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah, that's quite fraught, that topic. Yeah. And something that I picked up on and was quite interested by is, I know when you brought this story up at our editorial meeting, and even when we've talked about it now, it is really personal to you, but you haven't let any of that actually come into the written story. And I think at the spin-off we do a little bit, or maybe quite a lot more, kind of first person and personal storytelling than other outlets. And the haters hate us for it, but the lovers love us for it. But we are also really good at doing this really in-depth reporting like you've done here. I don't know how many people you've interviewed, like heaps. I wanted to ask you why you chose this really reported approach to the story, and removed yourself rather than telling it like a more personal narrative.
That's a really good question, Gabby. Very insightful. I think...
I don't think either is right or wrong. It's just something I noticed, yeah.
No, I get you. I think originally or initially I had sort of planned on it to be, from my perspective, and to talk about what we've just spoken about, my reasoning for wanting to look into this. But the more I went along this path, the more powerful I thought it would be speaking to people who could share their perspective, and I could probably delve into that a bit more. Not to say that their perspective is greater than mine or anything like that, but I just was interested, I think, actually, to get some insights from people who had gone down this journey, down the path a bit further than I had. I've sort of just learnt about this condition. So for me, it was important to speak to someone who has some experience, who is aware that they have a condition, and had gone through some processes or some steps along the process of navigating that journey. So that was probably the hardest part of this, was trying to find someone who was willing to speak to me about it.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Was that tricky? It's very topic very close to people's hearts, like children and family and all that kind of stuff. Where did you find the people to talk to, and why did they trust you so much? Because you got some really great quotes too.
Thanks.
My favorite being from Mitchell. He says, "I want to know so I can prepare. I'm not asking for a designer baby. I just want to know."
Yeah, it was quite a difficult part, like I've said, of the story, but really important. So I was asking around with, people that I knew had a condition or maybe had gone through some of these things. I reached out on my networks, and eventually, honestly, I just posted up on Facebook, and said, "Hey, is anyone willing to have a kōrero with me about this?" And I got a message from someone who I knew who said, hey, a mutual friend or colleague said, they saw your status and I'd be willing to have a chat with you about it. And so it definitely helped that I had worked with this person in the past and knew them, and so there was already a sort of base level, relationship there, and this understanding or trust built. So speaking with him about this was really great and added a lot to the story. Obviously, it's sort of been based around this person, Mitchell, it's not his real name. Yeah. But going through that, it made me realize, and it's sort of obvious, but it made me really appreciate how sensitive these issues can be for people, and how people aren't willing to open up quite often about genetic conditions for understandable reasons. But part of what I hoped to achieve with the story when I finished it was helping people to feel more comfortable talking about these things, because they are really impactful. It makes up who we are. So it's really important to talk about genetic conditions and things that affect us and impact us, because that's who we are, and it's going to determine how our lives go, basically, So, getting Mitchell to speak with me was really a key to getting the story across the line, because without that perspective, I could have added my own in, but I didn't really want to. And so, I placed a lot of value on getting someone like him to have a chat with me, and it made the piece, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's so nice to have his like voice and journey. Kind of, they structure the piece as well, like the opening and the closing. Yeah,
he was
great to be able to like capture that.
Yeah, he was really open and willing to chat with me. I think we spoke for close to an hour, if not over an hour, about it all, and he answered every question I had. And he's quite a well-considered person when he speaks, and I found it quite nice to have a conversation with him, and someone who was so willing to be so open with me about it, because it's not a light topic, but we've got the likes of Stan Walker and the Walkers, in that TV program that sort of tries to normalize being open about your genetic conditions and the impacts they have on you, and it's a big issue. I realized how big writing this article, but people just don't talk about genetic conditions. It's a very taboo, hush, even within families. I've got my own personal experiences, obviously, with my mother's condition, but also, other people in my family. And I mean, it's just crazy when you start to think about how much genetics plays a role in our everyday lives. So with my son and his genetic makeup, trying to get all the pieces to that puzzle together to understand or be aware of it, if there were any issues that might arise when he's an adult, or thinking about grandparents that have had cancer, and whether or not their parents had cancer, whether or not any of my parents' siblings have had cancer as well. Is that a genetic thing? And I think these are questions that quite often we don't stop to ask ourselves until sometimes it's too late. Or sometimes we just stumble across something and we're like, And then with my mother's deafness and her sister's deafness, obviously there's something going on there genetically, that you've got two sisters in the same family. One's fine, but the other two have hearing issues. So, it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, and led me down this path that made me realize that, there's a lot of issues impacting people with genetic conditions, and making it quite difficult for people to navigate that here in Aotearoa.
And with such a complex subject, how did you pull it off in so little words?
How did I pull it off in so little words? I think I tried to keep it quite narrow, there were issues that popped up, like genetic discrimination was one thing that came up.
Yeah.
And so there were these issues that I realized were important to mention, but I didn't want to delve too far into in one story. The crux of my story was about parents or people wanting to start families with genetic conditions and what that pathway is.
Yeah.
So
sticking to that while
yeah.
kind of nodding at all these influencing factors.
Yeah, trying my hardest to keep it like that's what the story's about. Acknowledging that there are other things going on that are really important and could be stories in their own right. But trying to paint the picture of what it's currently like in New Zealand, or what it's like compared to places overseas, and how we might improve, or what these people, these experts in this field feel like could help improve the current situation here in Aotearoa. So those were the three main points that I wanted to hit. Spoke with a few people, got some answers to that, found out a whole lot of other really interesting stuff. Touched on it a little bit, but yeah, tried to keep it as succinct as possible because there's a lot going on in this space and it's quite easy to, to veer off path.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it probably helped that my own experience and my own curiosity about what I might be able to do in the future for my kids and with my partner and my family sort of helped me have a good solid idea about what the story actually is and how to get it out in a way that people will be able to digest it, have some awareness of the issues at hand and hopefully gain something from it. And yeah, I just hope that it helped to sort of normalize families having conversations about these things. I remember being at hospital at Niku at Auckland Hospital with my son, and in there you just have the full range of experience, the human experience, right? And I remember one day we were out in the sort of like lobby area before you walk into the ward, and there was a son there talking about going to the bathroom with his mother, I think, and sister maybe. And they're all adults, but like the son was quite animated and quite angry and saying, this is why we need to have these conversations. So clearly, or from what I gathered, he had just had a child of his own and maybe discovered at that point that the child had a genetic condition that was hereditary that the rest of the whānau potentially had too, but had never had an open conversation about. So my hope is that more than anything, people can feel a bit more comfortable or inspired from the likes of this, the walkers, people like Andrew Schelling, who I speak to, about talking about, their genetics, where they come from, the things that make us who we are, issues that they might be facing that they think, I wonder if that's a hereditary thing, That's sort of my hope, is that this article in some small way helps even just one person.
Well, I've certainly got some questions to ask my family.
Yeah.
So you can consider that ticked off.
I feel good. I feel good about myself now. Thanks. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's what it's all about. And there are other issues in there that we touched on, like the genetic discrimination thing as well. Really massive issue. Yeah.
Do you think you will look into that for another story?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I mean, there's ongoing work with people like Andrew Schelling, who I spoke to, sort of lobbying for changes, policy and law changes in that space. So, yeah, I'll definitely be keeping a closer eye on it, especially now that I'm aware that I am part of this ecosystem or of this, of what's happening here. So, there's a lot to flesh out, but it's I felt like it was a good start nonetheless.
Oh, very much so.
Thanks.
Well, I think that's been a really great rundown of all the topics in your article and your approach to them and how it all came together. Thanks so much for joining us on Behind the Story. Loved having you.
Thanks, Gabby. It's nice to have you as a host too.
Oh,
For
thanks.
a little bit of a change. Nothing against Mad, but it's just cool to be on the podcast.
It's good to mix things up, eh?
It was nice.
That was Liam Rātana on Behind the Story. I'll be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.